the current situation in Darfur and Chad, and particularly as the Irish role in the peacekeeping mission in Chad is particularly prominent. Darfur is seen correctly as a test case for the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, and Chad is equally correctly seen as a test case for the new European Africa policy and peacekeeping doctrine. And the central question that I will return to towards the end of this presentation is, are we seeing the emergence of new and newly effective approaches to international peacekeeping in this part of the world? And my tentative conclusion is, I think we are, and I think therefore we have reason for concern, because I don't think it's going to work. What I'd like to do is to start off with a brief overview of the Darfur conflict and also of the war in Chad, before turning to an analysis and outline of how and why the peace support operations in those two places have been put together in the way that they have, and what we might expect. Now, what's well known about Darfur's war is that it's a large, sparsely populated, desperately poor region of northern Sudan, its western frontier, where there was a rebellion in early 2003, and that rebellion made very rapid progress, and was met with a very savage counterinsurgency onslaught by the government of Sudan, using its own forces, but most particularly using proxy militias known as Janjaweed. By the end of 2004, there were probably 200,000 people killed, or dead, the majority of them through hunger and disease and exposure, probably a quarter of them through violence. Since then, there have been ceasefire agreements, an attempted peace agreement, which haven't worked. The conflict has continued, and Chad has become deeply involved. Chadians are fighting on both sides. I'd like to suggest that we also look at Darfur through another lens, which is the lens of how the government of Sudan manages its peripheries. And there's a lot of historic continuities here. If we go back to the early and middle part of the 19th century, what we see is Sudan as a conquest state, as an imperial state really in its own right, with an elite that is based in the then commercial capital, Khartoum, a commercial and military elite that had drawn from a very small minority of the population with external support in the 19th century from Egypt, the first part of the 20th century from Britain, and more recently relying on its own resources but with its international linkages, managing a huge periphery, and a periphery with very, very little infrastructure, and with people who are themselves extremely independent, well-armed, and militarily actually quite well organized. So not an easy periphery to manage. And what we see is a gross imbalance in resources to start off with. If you go to Khartoum today, you will see a city that would not be out of place in Egypt, anywhere in the Middle East. It's essentially a middle-income city which is really very prosperous. Income per head in the thousands of dollars. The peripheries of Sudan are some of the poorest places on the planet, income per head of $100 or so a year, and a complete lack of basic infrastructure there. The centre has been, over more than 100 years, sufficiently well endowed that it has the political infrastructure to support not one but several elite groups. And within that, actually, usually a relatively liberal political culture within that elite, with newspapers, with universities, with all the institutions of a middle-income country. You go to the provinces and you see the elites there, and the the difference is very, very stark. These people have really very, very little in the way of infrastructure. There are really no educational institutions, no media, very little in the way of transport. Extreme poverty then helps determine the way the politics of the peripheries are run. And what the central elites have been doing in the 19th century, throughout the 20th century, even today, is to buy up, use patronage to buy the loyalty of selected members of the provincial elites. And in times of peace, what they want is they want votes. In times of war, they want militia. Because although the central government is very well endowed relative to the rest of the country, doesn't have the financial wherewithal to support the military or administrative means with which to actually run a modern state that would have the military power and the administrative strength to actually rule this vast territory and suppress dissent whenever it arises. So it does it through indirect means. In the 19th century, they talked about the metropolitan provinces around Khartoum and the military provinces, which were in the south and in the west, where the military governor had basically the authority to raise a tribal levy whenever a problem arose. Today, it's almost exactly the same. Under the British, it was called there was the developed Sudan around the Nile, where you had big irrigation projects and railways and towns and schools and so on. And then you had the closed districts, which were the south and the west, where the administrators ran it through what was called native administration. Basically, they got the chiefs to run affairs on their behalf. So Darfur was actually run by no more than 6 or 8 British colonial officers. The people with the power for running Darfur on a day-to-day basis were the tribal chiefs. So the administration was tribalized, and then when there was a crisis, the tribal administration was militarized. And I think it is this lens of how a faraway central elite with a lot of money compared to the peripheries, but very little in the way of a really effective military or administrative infrastructure organization in those areas. How it runs these peripheries, this is one of the ways in which we must understand Darfur and the crisis in Darfur. It is the militarization of tribe as an instrument of local control. So what happened in Darfur was that from the 1980s onwards, successive governments were trying to control Darfur by using local militia, really very ineffectively. And in 2003, the resistance to this got out of hand. It got out of hand primarily because the Southerners, the SPLA, started pouring large amounts of weapons in, and because the ruling party, the Islamist party, the National Congress Party, in Khartoum had split, and a number of its dissidents, who were very well organized, very well armed, fled to Darfur. And the combination of those two external factors meant that what had been a relatively effective strategy, at great human cost, of maintaining a modicum of control over this periphery, broke down. The insurgency got out of hand, and the counterinsurgency that was mobilized was exceptionally vicious. That counterinsurgency worked. By the end of 2004 or early 2005, the rebels were in disarray. Their military organization was essentially smashed. And what's happened is we have reverted to the previous way of managing conflict on that periphery, so that the Sudan government is continuing to use militarized tribal formations, both Arab and non-Arab. And the Arabs who were mobilized within the Janjaweed for that counterinsurgency, many of them recognizing that their interests had not been served by going and massacring their neighbors, began to have second thoughts, began to defect. Some of them joined the rebels, others of them mutinied. And essentially what they were doing was they were bidding up the price of loyalty. They were saying, we're available, but what you've offered for us is not enough. And the biggest Janjaweed